Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Real Context News Podcast with your host, Brian Freidenborg. That's me. Today is November 3rd, Election Day, and we have a special political podcast for you on this Election Day. Today, we have Dr. Mark Rush, Director of International Education and the Stanley D. and Nikki Waxberg Professor of Politics and Law at Washington and Lee University. He also happened to be my professor some 20 years ago. Welcome today to the podcast, Dr. Rush.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks, Brian.
I really appreciate you joining us, and let's just get right into it. You, apart from being an expert in many areas of politics, are something of a specialist in polls, at least at my alma mater at Washington and Lee, where you were the toughest stats professor east of the Mississippi, if I remember correctly.
Could be, yeah. No, we've done we use polling in how stats are applied and how you are able to either generate good data with them or you see, in various examples throughout history. When Harris first got established, the Literary Digest poll flopped. Why? And so, the study of polls is as much about just gathering good data as it is about polling per se to predict an election or anything. So, yeah.
And I remember one of the books from your class was How to Lie with Statistics. And so on that note, I'd like to mention that there's something of a general perception that the polls in the 2016 election cycle, quote unquote, failed, and you can't trust them. And from my understanding, and from what I've looked into, is that essentially there were individual polls, including some state polls, particularly Michigan, that really did not pass the test, but that in general, if you looked at most polls, most state polls, and most national polls, you would find a little concept that most of the general public doesn't even know about, called the margin of error, in which each poll is statistically accurate 95% of the time within a certain plus or minus. So if they say that Joe Biden's at 45% and Trump's at 42%, they'll say the margin of error is 3.5%, meaning both those numbers could be 3.5% higher or lower 95% of the time, and you would be accurate within the polling, and that the accuracy actually fell within this polling error, and that the surprise we had from Trump's numbers fell totally within that for the vast majority of polls. And I wanted to know if you had anything to add to that.
Well, in general, I think it depends. You can say particular states may have been off, but, again, unless they're state-based polling, the national polling folks are using the same methods everywhere. So it'd be odd if, Harris or CNN somehow botched it in Michigan and didn't botch it all the way, across the board with their methodology. Some things to think about, though. Right, you talk about the margin of error. And, the importance of that really came into play back in, I think, 2000, when, if you recall, the networks called Florida and they yanked it back and off we went to Bush v. Gore.
That's a terrible memory of mine that I still haven't recovered from, but yes.
But
at Washington and Lee's campus, I remember from my freshman year.
Oh. But, the problem number one there was, in the end, it looked like no matter how many times you recounted the votes, the margin of victory was going to be smaller than the margin of error. And therein lies a problem. Once you run into that area, polling becomes treacherous. And you need to have an accurate count. But the problem is you can count the votes 10 or 100 times, and you're probably not going to get always the same count just because of random error as well. So you've got that issue. If you have a really, really close state, and even if you're doing very good, carefully organized scientific polling, sometimes if the margin of victory is small and the margin of error, your predictions are going to be tough. Another thing that makes the polling difficult, though, now, there's several things that make it difficult. The things we hold in our hands now, the mobile phones, completely mess things up because you can have an area code in one state and live in another.
And I keep running into friends who say that, I've never been called by a pollster.
Right. Right, but still, if they use your number, they, if they're doing random dialing in, with your area code, they could pull you. But the question is, you got your first mobile phone when you were probably still living with your folks, maybe. That's typical of what's going on, and now you live somewhere else because you graduated school. So that's an issue. What makes things even more, I think, complicated now are two things. First, there's a non-trivial number of folks who just simply don't want to answer polls. That was shown in George W. Bush's support patterns. People just wouldn't vote, and so people were astounded when he won, second time. Just because, again, there's a certain resistance to young kids coming out to do polling. And, one of the things we learned from this, like everything else, is that if basically getting people to answer your polling questions if you're live and not on a phone isn't a whole lot different than trying to market. If you want to market, old white guys, you kind of need to have Archie Bunker types doing some of the polling. If you want to, pitch to suburban women, well, then you don't want someone who looks like Donald Trump going and doing that polling. You need to kind of appeal so that people will engage with you. And so they learned that early on in the century. Now, with, throwing a monkey wrench into things as well is, we've got mail-in voting and you have had early voting. And so this is going to throw off the exit polls because you can try to go and do a very carefully orchestrated exit poll, but that a non-trivial number of potential polling targets have already voted or aren't there. So, can we assume that the folks who are actually going to the polls are a representative sample of the population that compares to the characteristics of the folks who either went early or who mailed it in? And we'll find that out. It will be an important study, and you can expect, I think, some of the better polling organizations are already ahead on that.
Well, something that Nate Silver mentioned that I thought was interesting was that because of all the early voting going on this year, the higher quality pollsters were asking their voters which of you have actually already voted, and they were factoring that into the results as opposed to just saying, here's a likely voter and here's a registered voter. They could actually incorporate people who had definitely already voted and include that into their calculations. But there are two kind of into the weeds areas I'd like to dive into. The first being, you mentioned something about some of Bush's supporters were reluctant to respond to various pollsters.
Right.
And something I wrote, which I should have sent it to you before we were talking, but I essentially wrote a piece for Small Wars Journal where I talked about how Middle East conspiracies, or I should say just conspiracies in general, were very popular among the Arab population in the Middle East, but that if you look at America in the last few years, we've kind of started catching up to the Middle East in that regard, where conspiracy theories have really taken hold. And in particular, Donald Trump being the conspiracy theorist in chief, a lot of his supporters really buying into that. And if we go back to the 2016 election, I think there was quite a high percentage of his folks who were not terribly enthusiastic about responding to polls and had some levels of paranoia and conspiracy-minded ideas about the media. I would argue more intensely than in the era where George W. Bush was running for president, and that this was mirrored to some degree in that sort of quote-unquote lost hidden Trump voter phenomenon, where a lot more of those folks from small rural towns turned out and they weren't really captured in the polling, and that was part of why there was a margin of error and a surprise show in his support.
Right. No, I think, and again, if you look at this, then if you're going to do live polls, you need to basically, appear similar to the people you're trying to poll. And so, yeah, the coastal media suits or whatever, so to speak, you think of your typical, whatever stereotypical image that your mind conjures up when you think of somebody who appears on, regularly on network media. They're not likely to walk into the dollar store or, the local, Cracker Barrel and be able to get much affect with people if they really appear to be an outsider. So again, you need to be solicitous in a way that gets people that, that want to talk with you. Similarly, another problem related to is that folks, when they're on their phones now, they can just ignore numbers they don't recognize. And so in many cases, again, a pollster just doesn't even get in the door if they're dialing in advance. So, I think ironically, polling's a science, and the folks who do it are good scientists, but they need to adapt their methods of data collection to, the new polling environment, which is a function, in many cases, of just how people perceive the media in general. Pollsters is a subset of that. And then how people now just, ignore phone calls from numbers that they don't recognize. If you're important, you'll leave me a message. If not, I'm going to block you,
Sure. And before I get to my second in the weeds dive, there's another tangential in the weeds dive related to what you mentioned. I just want to get into where something I've noticed, and you mentioned the whole cell phone phenomenon and the way that has made it harder for pollsters. Something I've noticed is that if you look at the sample size over the last few election cycles, you can definitely see a decrease in the average sample size, where it's been harder for pollsters to get a hold of various people. And this will play into my next point, but larger point. But yeah, it's harder with cell phones, and with the pandemic, I noticed, especially at the very beginning of March, you had some excellent quality exit polls and entrance polls in terms of caucuses, when you talked about Super Tuesday and the early, before that, the early primary states. And then you jump ahead to later on, and I remember looking at Florida, which is a huge state, and they had a sample size of about 800 people, where larger states on Super Tuesday had several thousand people. And I was trying to get into the crosstabs to look at how younger Hispanics have voted in Florida. And they did not have enough Hispanics that they had interviewed to even break them down by age. You just had the Hispanic vote, period. And you had the white vote, which was broken down by age, but they just did not have enough people from different age groups with Hispanic voters to even have that data. And I was just thinking to myself, it's very interesting, because people like you and me who love going through these crosstabs and these particular demographic subsets of responses with the exit polling and entrance polling and what have you, there's a lot of states that voted during this cycle in the primaries, and we'll see how it turns out today and with early voting. But there's a lot of states that they just clearly, you could see the drop in the number of people being interviewed because of the pandemic. I mean, first of all, you have fewer people voting in person, and second of all, I can just imagine being a voter and having someone come up to you in the middle of a pandemic and trying to ask you questions about your vote. And it was hard enough to get people to respond before the pandemic. And with that, I think that it's just such a challenge that we're going to have a lot of lower quality data and less complete data this election cycle.
Yep. No, it's not going to help any, for sure. Folks just don't want to get close to others. And again, when you're doing that kind of polling, ideally it's just you and me speaking. So, it's public, but you're not broadcasting your thoughts. And if you actually have to raise your voice to shout to the pollster metaphorically across the parking lot, it's going to diminish the number of people who want to engage in it,
For sure. And the last kind of general in the weeds polling question I have related to the others is that when you look at 2016, there was actually a few very interesting articles put out by a group of pollsters who had specialty in approaching Hispanic voters. And they found that their much higher sample size and it would seem to me higher quality polling was able to address some of the issues involved in approaching the American Hispanic voting population, and to get a much more accurate portrayal of those voters. And they showed that there was actually record turnout beyond what the normal exit polls had showed. A record turnout for Hillary Clinton, especially in states like Texas and Arizona. And when you do all the math that they did and the way they explain it, it explains why she overperformed in a way where the other polls do not. And being that so many people are curious about the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote this election cycle, the points that they raised were that, first of all, you have the language barrier. You were mentioning it's important, who's interviewing who. Well, there's a lot of Hispanics that will not be included if their household or the person, maybe it's the parents that aren't fluent in English, maybe the kids are, but they're not the ones answering the phone, and they get lost on pollsters because of that. There's also the fact that, they're spread across in many different communities as opposed to African Americans who are more concentrated in terms of their physical locations in the United States, and they're easier to approach in certain precincts. Also because of redistricting, we'll get into that. But yeah, if you have anything to add to the idea that the Hispanic population is a bit harder to poll and why, that would be really interesting.
Well, I think also, and I haven't taken a deep dive into the Hispanic population or any of the ethnic groups, honestly, but or one knows too, I think, when we refer to the African American population, it tends to be, as you said, a little more concentrated, a little more consistent, but Hispanic is a very, very broad word. Cubans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans are not the same. There's radical differences in their politics, and so the vote, I think, is correspondingly less predictable. Depends on the state they're in too, So yeah, for certain, as you noted, there may be more challenges in getting a good sense of the Hispanic population than other groups.
Moving on to this year's election cycle, there's a lot of people who will see polls, and my personal least favorite storyline or article that you can find, and there are many that I would put into that category, but it's when a particular network comes out with, or a polling firm comes out with a poll, and you see an article saying, this poll or our poll has the candidate up X points, yada, 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 and they do not mention any other polls. They do not mention the average of the polling. They simply say, here's what our poll says. And then you'll often find other outlets will simply have a repeat headline copying that information. And the point I guess I'm trying to emphasize here is that part of the reason that people don't understand or don't trust polling is the way the media presents it, where more often than not they highlight their own polls and do not show a statistical average, because what we're looking at are a bunch of data points, and no individual poll, with the exceptions of some of the highest quality pollsters, are worth terribly paying attention to, as opposed to saying, here's what the collective data points tell us. And on that note, I was hoping you could tell us, what are you seeing as far as reading the tea leaves for the collective polling this election cycle, and how is it different from the polling in previous cycles?
Well, I think it's hard to say at this point because the polls are still rolling in, and there'll be all the postmortems tomorrow and days after to look at, which polls worked and which didn't. I think more to the point, though, you hit it spot on. It really is irresponsible journalism to say, well, here's, the latest poll that we like, essentially, as you said.
And it's whether it's the New York Times or it's CNN or the Washington, they all do it. And I just don't understand that at this point, because they must have, this is probably one of the reasons Nate Silver stormed out in a rage from the New York Times, where you have some kind of nerdy polling data journalist types telling them you can't do these. But I think that in terms of the corporate side of things and the editorial side of things, one of their favorite things to do is to be able to say, here's our poll, period, not talking about other polls at all. And it just, at a certain point, something that has really bothered me about the 2016 election cycle is that I don't think the media has really owned any of its major mistakes from reporting that election cycle, and reporting single polls Especially during the primaries, you would hear them say something like, "Oh, Warren or Harris are a front runner," where they never in the polling average ever pass Biden. Even if they did in one or two individual polls, the polling average never had them as the front runner, and yet you would see the New York Times, because of this poll or their own poll or other thought leaders, claiming that there were multiple front runners in the Democratic race when Biden was ahead the whole time, and no one ever challenged that in terms of an average of data points.
Sure. I mean, if you look at it again, it's just irresponsible across the board, I think. Any professional knows that one poll is useless.
And I know that. I mean, for me, I'm not trying to, give you too much of a obsequious treatment here, but in your very fine stats class, that was one of the first things that anybody, if someone came in for one class and then dropped out, they would remember that from your class.
Now, one data point doesn't help you, and especially now, more than ever, when I think you have a couple of things in play. And it's rather paradoxical, because on the one hand, if you sort of look at the American political landscape, we are in an era of polarization, septic polarization, really that we haven't seen. I mean, I can't think of any time, really, where the country has been so divided.
You have to go back to Reconstruction and the Civil War, honestly.
Probably, yeah. No, even Vietnam, because, even with Vietnam, the divisions there had to do with, things like 18-year-olds having to go to war and not being able to vote on a thing.
Yeah, there was a huge consensus on Vietnam until middle class kids started getting drafted. But you look at those presidential elections from that era; none of them were close. 64, 68, and 72, they were all blowouts. 60 was close, but Vietnam wasn't really.
Because of Wallace.
Yeah.
But if you look
not
because
of Vietnam,
it is peculiar that you've got such apparent, partisan polarization. Yet, on the other hand, there is so much information available, even for people who simply, dial in only to the discrete news sources that they like. There is still such an incredible amount of information available that people can change their opinions more radically. Number one. Number two, people, whoever you want to call them, influencers, can provide an incredible quantity of new information, right up until the election now, in ways that, you never could 50 years ago, or at least before, the advent of social media. So as a result, I think people's opinions are a bit more unstable or unpredictable, let's put it that way, because of the supply of information that's available. And then because of this, I think you're more likely, despite having very good scientific polling methods, to run into some issues about the nature of information and preferences that really haven't been addressed yet, or addressed well yet. If you think about the typical economics literature, which underpins this, you and I have our preferences about everything from ice cream to the color of the car we want to drive, to our politics, and that they get somewhat fixed over time, blah, blah. And unless there's a political earthquake, a realignment to something was the old, traditional word. That's probably not going to change much, and so now, however, those preferences are on the one hand, they are constantly reinforced, right, by marketers who want us to come out and buy the same stuff and promote their brand loyalty. But on the other hand, there's a whole bunch of other things we can see, clicks, whatever that Facebook or Twitter provides, whatever, that can distract us a little bit because somebody plays the odds. And even though I may come across as a raging left-wing or right-wing, person, somebody has seen that, I clicked on the Arby's coupon, even if I did it by accident, or whatever.
I've been staying at friends' places a few times in the last year, and I would have checked something out on my computer connected to their Wi-Fi, and they would see advertisements related to that on their phones and their computers.
Yep. So it's remarkable. Yeah, you use the same IP address, and boom. So, and I cannot get my arms around that from my armchair here. I mean, professional pollsters in their confessions, learning about this will tell you, I think, those sorts of stories. And one of our alumna and my good friend, you missed her, but Jennifer Angies, polling at CNN, right, has written stuff about this too, and just talks about the challenges. I mean, you've got really good science, the methods are solid, but the world you're measuring has shifted. So we're not exactly in if you're familiar with Thomas Kuhn and the whole idea of the structure of scientific revolutions, it's not as if we are suddenly waking up one day and discovering that the world is round and our flat world maps don't work very well anymore. But we're sort of in that general direction where we know the polling methods have worked, but the nature of information that people get has changed. And there's so much of it that it's changing the way people behave and think. And so polling needs to adapt. It's not that the polling methods are bad. It's not that, well, they can be done badly, but the basics of polling and sampling and whatnot remain, solid. They're based on the laws of probability. But we need to get a better sense of how people behave in order to apply those probabilities better. And that's what I think we see going on, but no one's really caught up with that yet.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Although one thing that I like to do in particular is follow 538's weighted polling average, because what most of the other sites that I've looked at do is they simply take every poll and they just do an average of however many polls in the last X days without adjusting for quality, bias, or because some polls, I mean, Rasmussen is a great example, and I don't know what goes on in their heads when they're conducting the polls, because their bias is so, I don't think it's necessarily even on purpose. It's just, it's so demonstrable. They're always higher results for Republicans than Democrats in their polls, just day in and day out. So you can adjust for that, and you can adjust for their reliability. So even the bias may not necessarily even affect the reliability rating, as long as they're consistent and they have sound polling. You can just say they skew X percent this way. But they'll take the most recent polls and weigh them more than slightly older polls. They'll weight higher quality polls, especially ones with sample size, which if our viewers don't know, the number of people you interview dramatically increases the accuracy of whatever poll you're doing, all things being equal. And there's something called standard deviation, which will basically tell you how much the answers could veer one way or the other if it was perfectly accurate versus the sample, because you can never interview everybody. And by interviewing many people as opposed to fewer people, you have a smaller deviation from what that ideal truth would be. And so, 538, as opposed to Real Clear Politics, actually has a whole methodology where they grade the pollsters and they factor all these things and they weight polls differently. And their polling average right now nationally has Biden up 8.4%, 51.8% to 43.4%, remarkably consistent, but slightly tighter the last few days than the past few weeks. And a lot of the swing state polls, especially the kind of blue Midwestern wall that Trump destroyed, meaning Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, there's at least a 6-point margin roughly in Pennsylvania for Biden, but there's higher, closer to 8+% with Michigan and Wisconsin. But then you have the other swing states where in the South where it's a lot closer. Also Ohio, it's a lot closer. But the race essentially, the 8+8.4%, that actually carries through into some of the key swing states. So I wanted you to speak for our last question on the polls in terms of Biden having an 8.4% national spread and a pretty healthy lead in the polls with swing states, the key ones, that he can, the ones where it's closer are states he can afford to lose. The ones where he's up a lot more are the ones he needs. But I wanted you to speak to the state of the race and the state of polling this particular cycle with specific numbers and just how you think that's going to play into the actual outcome.
Well, honestly, I never worried too much. I don't think too much about how the polls play into the actual outcome because they don't matter. The outcome's the outcome. Polling is a race to see who can predict the outcome, but in the end, it doesn't really matter who predicts the outcome. What matters is what the outcome is. So to tell you the truth, right now it does seem some of the more, I think, reputable polling places are demonstrating that, at least the numbers are suggesting, Biden should win pretty handily. But, again, this is what we thought 4 years ago. So, we thought Hillary would win, and it didn't work out that way. So I do wonder what will come out of this. Perhaps there really is a nationwide shift towards Biden, or at least away from Trump. On the other hand, perhaps, we'll find out that, again, there's some flaw that we missed, or folks weren't answering the polls, or a non-trivial number of people who fall into a particular group weren't answering the polls or whatnot. And so we'll find out. But again, I always wonder, to me, I understand for campaigning, people want to have polling data and know that sort of stuff. But for the voter who votes, whether or not a pollster is successful in predicting the election really doesn't matter as much as what the actual election result is. And again, the polls, what's important to note is the polls themselves, when it comes down to it, are inconsequential. They are never a substitute for the actual election result. It's just sort of like voter registration is meaningless. I can be a Reagan Democrat, I can be, a liberal Republican, whatever the case may be. You get the idea. I can register one way because
or a Biden Republican. There we go. That could be a new thing this year.
Biden Republican, but you get the idea. Where
I know a few of those. There aren't too many, but I know a few.
Sure, but I mean the point is that what I tell a pollster really is irrelevant because it's how I cast my vote that matters, and I may not be telling the pollster truth, or my registration may be one way and my vote may be another for reasons that are known only to me. So I mean it's good. And again, I give you Truman beats Dewey, or Dewey beats Truman, right? Truman beats Dewey. That's what scares everybody right now because they blew it back then, and they blew it 4 years ago. And you would hope that that doesn't happen. But to the extent it does, what you wonder about is this a problem of actual network or polling organization bias, or is there something out there that the scientists just don't have their hands around yet, and it just requires a bit more time? And that's why I like reading some of the folks, Wang up at Princeton, Jennifer Agiesta at CNN, and so on, when they talk about why the models aren't working. But it's all good stuff, and what matters is we'll see, I hope, tomorrow. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Well, there's definitely problems. I guess the one spot where I would push back is that I feel like, as opposed to blowing it, now there were certainly individual states polls that were way off, Michigan in particular, and I'd like to come to that in a minute. But I feel like when you look at the general polling average over the last dozen election cycles, there's a lot of accuracy. More often than not, they're pretty close, and if they're off, quote unquote, they're actually within their actual margin of error, which is exactly what happened last time. So the surprise difference we had in the polling average was very much within that statistical margin of error, and people forget that the polls are predicting the vote. That's not necessarily the Electoral College. So Hillary Clinton was still up, instead of something like 4%, which is what the polls had, 2.1% within that margin of error, and most state polls were accurate. But it's interesting to see where they messed up, and in particular, something that I find gives me a little more confidence with the polling this year is there just seems to have been an overcorrection in every swing state. Let's have tons of polls, because there were several swing states last cycle where they just didn't have that many. You look at Michigan, most people assumed, including the Clinton campaign, they were going to come out on top with that because all the polling had shown a very healthy lead there, but there wasn't that much. And they actually blew it, if you remember, what Nate Silver called probably one of the perhaps the worst modern polling screw up. Michigan in the primary, Bernie Sanders eked out a win over Hillary, and she had been up by a lot. And what's interesting this cycle is that, and this now we're getting a little bit away from polling, but just Joe Biden, and we can transition to some other topics, but Biden did so much better than Clinton did in Michigan in the primary. And what I have argued, to the consternation of many an online troll, is that as popular as Bernie Sanders was, especially for an old Democratic socialist who wasn't even a Democrat running in the Democratic Party's primary, a good chunk of his support in 2016 was simply an anti-Hillary vote. Because if you look at every single state with the exception of, I believe, Nevada and California, he actually did worse by far in most cases, percent-wise, than he did in 2016 in the primary. And he did way worse in Michigan. And there were several states, not just Michigan, but also Oklahoma, for example, and Washington State, Hawaii, where he did so much better than Clinton in 2016. He lost to Biden this time around. And in Michigan, you can actually look at the maps from 2016 to 2020 in terms of the primary, where he won almost every county against Clinton. And this time around, Biden won almost every county versus Sanders, except for, he won all of them except for one in Michigan. And what you saw was that this sort of mythical white working class, they're not that mythical, but the pollsters talk about them sometimes in mythical terms. A lot of white working class voters in the industrial Midwest went over to Biden from Clinton. And there were higher turnouts as well in the primaries than there were in 2016. So something that tells me is that some of those people, because if you looked at that Michigan primary in 2016, hindsight, there were warning signs about Trump beating Clinton there. And in this case, I think the warning signs are the reverse, that Biden's beating Clinton. And what I love about the polls is, in this case, they really do match the reality, which is that, A, Joe Biden was in charge of the auto bailout, and people sure know that in Michigan. Trump's rhetoric has really turned off some of the more educated whites. It's funny because it's not the minority vote that has shifted so much. It is the white vote this election cycle. And if you look at the different signs and the different reasons why Biden might be more competitive than Clinton, I think that's mirrored particularly well in Michigan, and particularly well in the polling there, which has, if anything, Michigan is a safe Democratic state this cycle. We'll see what happens, but it seems like a lot of the shifts that we've seen can best be exemplified in Michigan, and it's interesting to see that shift. And I just was hoping you could comment on that.
I don't know. I always look at Michigan as a impressive example of what can go wrong in 2016. Early on, I think it was the weekend right after the election, Michael Moore was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, just going on about the fact that there was some 100,000 votes cast, where you basically had straight Democratic votes right down the ticket, and the presidential line was left blank. So, when you look at that, that tells you, about Hillary's appeal as opposed to Biden's appeal. And, again, so I think, as you're suggesting, well, maybe Biden's demonstrating strengths this time around vis-a-vis the party generally, and vis-a-vis challenges such as Bernie in particular. But again, we'll see. I think, the results will tell us how accurate the polls have been. There will be the Sunday morning quarterbacking with regard to the sorts of things you're describing, the leads they had and whatnot, what they've indicated, and relative strengths vis-a-vis other candidates. Again, right now, at least it looks like Biden should win this. We'll see. I think that's the way to bet, but I don't tend to bet on these things because it doesn't really matter too much. Again, in the end, I don't care. Betting on the accuracy of the polls projection is less important than how you think the actual electoral result. And again, understanding and for people to understand how the Electoral College works and why it's there, I think, is a key, component to that, and that's something that the media does a poor job of touching upon.
Among other things.
Object of criticism. No, but it's become an object of criticism and complaint. It has worked fine for the better part of 250 years, and I remember on Vox a couple of years ago. Ezra Klein was going on about how, the political process is stacked in favor of Republicans, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, yeah, I guess right now they have a certain advantage, but you can't pretend to think that, the founders way back when was sitting there, in some dark room looking to put the screws to the Democrats by, creating a system that would somehow, provide overrepresentation to something called Wyoming in the future. Number one. Number two, they've gone through several, different formulas to reapportion or to apportion seats among the states since the founding, and they've tweaked them here and there just to address anomalies and so on. And so you've got constitutional math, and you've got the way the Constitution is designed to work. And yeah, if that means, for now that the Electoral College does not necessarily follow the popular vote, that may be unfortunate, but it isn't unconstitutional, and it's a manifestation of a certain rationale underpinning a nation that is created from states, and it's a federal country. It would go a long way, I think, towards having faith in the electoral system if media actually address this a bit more instead of, really now just using the Electoral College as a whipping boy for one of the things that's wrong with the country. It's like, it's not. It serves a certain purpose in the same way as the Senate does, in the same way as the House does. And both the House and Senate are less than accurately representative of the states because of the formulas used to
by design
allocate power among them. Yeah. But even within the House, which is, arguably more representative, it isn't perfectly representative because theoretically, I have to go back and check the actual numbers, but I think there's 4 or 5 states that theoretically shouldn't even have one seat in the House, but they get one, and then they get 2 senators. That's
North and South Dakota, 4 senators total.
Yeah. There you go. And again, I don't think when the Dakotas were drafted, somebody figured that they'd be, no one even knew what a Trump meant, right? So, but this also is not uncommon. And again, I think it's a great manifestation of what I like to describe as, growing, overwhelming American myopia or tunnel vision. When we have our conversations about race or ethnicity or whatever, we speak, it's funny, all of a sudden American exceptionalism rears its ugly head. And we speak as if our versions of racial problems or ethnic problems are somehow unique to us and that we suffer them uniquely and so on and so forth. Look around the world. Race, ethnicity, tribalism, call it what you will, is everywhere. In the States, there may be white privilege. In China, there is Han Chinese privilege, right? And that's the ethnic minorities there who's calling the shots. If you look around the world at how federal nations are organized, or federal organizations in general, they have the same sorts of issues that the United States does. They don't have an electoral college, fair enough. But we can fix the electoral college. I'll get back to that in a second. But they do have, formula for allocating power among the constituent parts, which aren't exactly equal. And so in the European Union, it's much better to be Belgium or Liechtenstein than Germany. In terms of bang for the euro, Liechtenstein, Belgium voters have much more power in the European Union than Germany does per capita. But Germany is still a bigger state.
Just like voters in Kentucky have way more influence given their Senate majority leader and just the way the system works compared to California.
That's
the way it works.
Yeah, but that has less to do with Kentucky per se and the structure of the system than, say, McConnell's ability to operate in Washington, which isn't necessarily connected to the Electoral College. That's
sure, yeah. Well, it's a connection of both aspects of the system whereby particular senators with very high seniority can get a lot of perks to their state, but that a smaller rural state like Kentucky will also have more per capita representation than a large state like California. And this goes back to the founders where, to get states like Rhode Island and Connecticut and Delaware to literally ratify the Constitution, there was a compromise made to make sure that we would have protections in place so that smaller states wouldn't just be totally dominated by the larger,
Right.
more populous
Exactly.
states, because they were independent colonies who had united in a, who knows, it could have been a temporary union to fight off the British and to sell them on the joining of a stronger union. Those protections were included. So I actually respect the Electoral College in terms of its original purpose to prevent smaller states from being overrun by the larger states. At the same time, as an urban city dweller myself, the founders certainly had a bias. We can understand why from their era and even to some degree in our era, but there was a bias against landless urban voters, or I should say landless urban citizens, having an equal say to small rural landowners. That was the ideal at the time. And the system at the time was reflective of a country that was overwhelmingly rural. And I think that what we have to do today, since the country has now become majority urban and the demographics have shifted so much, I think we have to rethink the favoring of the rural folks, so much so at the expense of the urban folks, whereas before that did overrepresent America in general, now it very much underrepresents that. So I think part of the flaws today that we have is that the system reflected and worked well for an America from the late 18th, early 19th century, but that you do have a lot of city dwellers who are essentially disenfranchised now. In some ways, similar to the arguments Lincoln made about slave owners, because of the Three-Fifths Clause. This is an argument a lot of people forget. South Carolinian white voters had more of a say and more rights than free white voters in Maine. And so, I do. I'm not saying that we have to abolish the Electoral College, but I do think there's some tinkering that is
Sure. Well,
overdue.
there's two options. First, if people want to go to work, they have to amend the Constitution, but that takes a heck of a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
States are free to allocate their votes proportionally. They just have to get up and do it. But no one, so again, the solution is there. You could easily do that. But either way, those electoral votes are still based on, the combination of your House and Senate numbers. And so Wyoming's always going to have a little bit more bang for the buck. But again, the system has worked fine for the better part of 250 years. And again, when you go back and you look at issues, all Gore had to have done was win Kentucky, and then Florida wouldn't have mattered. So it's not quite.
Or New Hampshire.
Yeah. But I mean, the point is, the media tends to dumb this down in a way that is frankly disingenuous. And the Electoral College is not rocket science. Well, back to a point I was making before, the UN, all countries have one vote except for the Security Council, right? I mean, so, and people say that's a good thing. So, people like this when it works. They dislike it when it doesn't work. And again, you're right. I think the Electoral College is kind of bizarre, but unfortunately it's in the Constitution, and to get rid of it, we'd have to amend the Constitution or simply change the formula by which the states allocate the votes. They could do that. So, again, I don't understand why, Democratic senators should be leaning on their state governments, calling for this. I mean, it could be done. There's no reason why it couldn't be. And perhaps this election will give us a push towards that. But again, in the meantime, the Electoral College is in the Constitution, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But it, in and of itself, is not biased. And right, if migration patterns within the United States have made us a more urban country now, then sure, this does, as a result, favor the empty states in ways we might not have thought about before. But it's not a partisan bias. It is simply a formula that happens to work, and, we can't control the way people move. So.
Well, since this is election day, and we were talking about, the polling looks like Biden's going to win. And my take on this is that in a free and fair election, it's pretty clear, sure, some catastrophic, insane polling error that has never happened before on this scale, Biden would win in a free and fair election. But something that we're dealing with here, and we have to bring up a little bit of history, is that in 2013, the Voting Rights Act, which had been the law of the land for many years since the mid-'60s, was somewhat gutted by the Supreme Court. and what you had, and we can go back to history in the town where the college you teach at that I attended in Lexington, Virginia. You can go back from the end of the Civil War through Reconstruction, where there were all kinds of shenanigans, and this was all throughout the South and some other parts of the country as well, designed to keep particular people, especially African Americans, freed slaves, from voting. And the Voting Rights Act protected these jurisdictions, the people in them, from tampering by local, particularly racist governments, by requiring them to get federal permission to change their voting rights laws. And what happened from 2013 on is that particular provision was struck down by the Supreme Court, John Roberts writing memorably and somewhat infuriatingly that, racial discrimination is somewhat of a thing of the past, and if you want to get over racism, the best way is to not discriminate by race and to not have these types of, the term was pre-clearance, as far as the ability for states to change their voting rights, getting permission from the Department of Justice. And ever since then, we've seen a tremendous amount of efforts, especially pretty much on the part of Republicans, to limit the right to vote, to tamper with it. And then what we have now in the middle of a pandemic is a president that is literally trying to sabotage the mail system to a certain degree that he thinks it will help him not have Democratic votes counted, because what some people need to realize is by roughly a 2-to-1 margin, Republicans are more comfortable with in-person voting and Democrats are more comfortable with mail-in voting, because in our somewhat dystopian political system or situation right now, Republicans are much less likely to take the coronavirus pandemic seriously because of the rhetoric of Trump and leading Republicans and right-wing media, and Democrats are much more likely to take the pandemic seriously, and that's why they prefer mail-in voting. So tampering with the mail by a 2-to-1 margin, you're gonna, or more, be tampering with Democratic votes. And so what we're seeing this election cycle is all these court challenges happening even now, where the Republicans are trying to limit vote counting and especially mail-in ballots and how they're counted. And so what you can't account for in any polling is stealing, cheating, whatever term you want to use, voter suppression. And the question for me is not, are the polls accurate? Even if they're off, Biden wins. The question for me is, will Biden win by enough that this type of shenanigans and stuff that was very familiar in our past from Reconstruction all the way through the Jim Crow era, will Biden's win in any particular swing state be large enough to overcome this deficit? Because there's no way to factor into a poll, take off 2% here because you can count on the state government of Georgia to suppress and cheat and not count certain votes. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, because I feel like that's truly the biggest issue, and it's certainly being talked about by the media, but really it's the outcome of the election is going to depend on how effective and how much Republicans are able to cheat, and a lot of that has to do with the court system, and with the new Supreme Court justice having just been installed, about to weigh in on some of these cases. I think people underestimate the ability for having a whole bunch of Bush v. Gores settle this election as opposed to the actual votes.
Well, you packed a lot into that. I guess we can try to unpack it a little bit.
Fair enough.
First, in the Shelby County decision, it was unfortunate they struck down the pre-clearance, well, actually Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which fed the pre-clearance provisions of Section 5. But frankly, the states had a good argument, and unfortunately, Congress didn't respond. This is part of the nature of American politics. It doesn't always go the way we want, and it certainly isn't easy. And so, the argument simply was we shouldn't be forced to go through pre-clearance here in 2013 based on data from 1965.
And briefly, I wrote about Roberts and his decision. I'm not a fan of his ideology, but I do think he's a decent man, and I respect him. And I think in his mind, in the ideal kind of way that a conservative justice tends to think, it's like, as you mentioned, those provisions shouldn't be valid. They shouldn't have sway over what's going on now, A, and B, Congress should update the law to reflect the newer reality. And those are two shoulds that aren't compatible with each other if they don't both happen. So I think there is sound reasoning that yes, we need to, but the idea that Congress is going to just update this now, and I do wonder if he partly regrets his decision, because the effects of that have been catastrophic and almost immediate and very measurable. And my issue with conservative judicial philosophy is that they kind of look at things as the way they ought to be and not as the way they are. But yeah, I think that you touched it right on you hit the nail on the hammer with the hammer right there on the head.
But unfortunately, the court's job is not to decide whether or not to uphold the law based on its particular opinion of a particular Congress. And it was posed with a specific question, which unfortunately made sense. You wouldn't sell your house now based on its value from 60 years ago. You'd say the data are lousy. These data were equally lousy. According to the states, I agree it was an unfortunate decision, but you're right, Congress could have fixed that. They could have fixed the Citizens United decision too, but they didn't, because unfortunately there's partisanship. It isn't for a court to step in and take the temperature of that partisanship and then decide whether or not it should strike down a particular law. Now, you are right. If you look across the South, especially in the jurisdictions that are covered, basically running from Texas up through the Carolinas, you do see patterns. It's rather remarkable how many polling places have closed in areas of high concentrations of minority voters and so on and so forth.
And super briefly, people talked about the drop in the black vote from 2012 to 2016, and the media. I'm biased declared here. I'm a Hillary Clinton fan. I don't think she's perfect by any means, but the media was all too willing, I would argue, to ascribe this entirely to Hillary's quality as a candidate or lack thereof relative to Barack Obama. And obviously, the first black president in history, not that black voters are sheep and will just simply vote for someone who's black, but there was a level of enthusiasm for him that was always going to be higher than Hillary's. But people do not mention this Supreme Court decision in between the 2012 and 2016 election, and the amount of voters who were suppressed in places like North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. I think the Mother Jones did a study where some 800,000 voters had been purged from the rolls in Wisconsin, and the margin was not even 10% of that. So the effects of this, as you mentioned, it's been swift and measurable, and I don't think it's something the media talks about enough, because people don't want to admit that our system might not have fair voting situations, but that is actually reality.
Well, again, that also depends on who controls the state legislatures and so on and so forth. And again, Wisconsin, you take a look at the different states, which ones are blue, which ones are red in state legislatures, which ones are purple. And again, there's a lot of Wisconsin's now controlled by Republicans. Illinois is still a Democratic place, and so forth. So you do see this sort of, as you say, shenanigans going on. It's unfortunate. On the other hand, it's also, frankly, the price we pay for living in the federal nation, where constitutionally the federal government really can't reach down into the states to do that, to do much about that. And we look at this today and you kind of wonder, well, does the country need something akin to what happened in the New Deal, where all of a sudden the federal government is able to assert itself more pervasively down into politics? I think so, especially with regard to procedures such as voting and what. I can understand that perhaps once upon a time there really was a firm belief that there's a radical difference between a Dakota, a Louisiana, and a Connecticut. In some ways, they clearly are, culturally or whatnot. But voting procedures are pretty straightforward. We could fix this.
Yeah, equal protection clause would be a good foundation to argue that.
Well, that's always been there, but the problem was what the Voting Rights Act did was to make it easier for folks to challenge discriminatory procedures, whatnot. Much easier to do that under Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act than under the Equal Protection Clause. But in any event, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's the way it goes. And you would think, it's going to take some sort of, switch in time, sort of what the Supreme Court engaged in when Roosevelt got angry and threatened to pack it back in the 30s. The difference is now, well, okay, politics is a lot more partisan. If Congress remains divided, if the Dems, if you don't have basically one party control of both houses and the presidency, then you're not going to see much in the way of that kind of action, I think. And plus, even any attempt to push that kind of action will certainly generate litigation, reasonably so, because we are a federal country and the states can resist it. Even if it simply comes down to things such as unfunded mandates and whatnot, which are, quite reasonable. Whether it's, well, it jerks at your heartstrings, but we've seen this especially with regard to immigrants' rights, where states such as California and Texas, hardly two states that think the same, both complained and signed on to complaints, over the last several decades about immigration policy, because while the national government controls the border, when immigrants enter, they enter into states. And states would claim, well, you're forcing us to deal with these folks because you run a porous border, give us some money. And, folks say, well, that's just California or Texas complaining about Washington. Well, it's not that. When the Congress makes a decision, there is no Washington. It's a Congress made up of Minnesota.
Yeah, Washington doesn't even have binding representation. That's
well, but that's thing. Not what I'm speaking to here. The I was being is comprised of but it's comprised of Minnesotas and Montanas and all these
exactly.
states. Really don't have
people always complain about Washington, but that's literally the representatives of the states casting their votes. That's what, when people complain about Washington, there is no Washington vote. It's all of your states voting together. That's why we get what we get.
When a California or a Texas complain about an unfunded mandate, it comes out of that. Yes, this doesn't affect Illinois or Minnesota. But I mean, again, this could be done. It would require some, creative, or not even creative, just well thought federal policy. When you think about it, we standardize speed limits and drinking gauges and everything else. You can standardize this too. It can be done. The thing about voting machines and procedures, however, you have to admit, you're talking about a pretty radical transformation of procedures down to, the metaphorical dog catcher election. It's expensive. Americans vote for everything. In contrast to European countries, Latin American countries, we elect everything all the time. We actually have voter fatigue compared to them. And
our campaigns are so much longer. Much longer.
Well, we never stop because, we don't have the parliamentary system. So, but again, so there are trade-offs. But yeah, I think there's things you could do to change the American political system. Unfortunately, many of them would require constitutional amendment or at least an ability of the federal government to reach out and reach down into the state governments and start cleaning up some messes. But that's an awful lot of litigation.
That's what the Voting Rights Act did too for so long. In one regard.
And again, even when it was passed, though, the Supreme Court heard cases, and even Justice Black, who was a liberal, a big civil libertarian, said, there's a problem here. A whole bunch of other states are putting a smaller number of states under the yoke here. While I back the spirit of it, he pointed out this really is a problem. We're creating a class of second-tier states who are beholden to the others. But anyway, that's just, constitutional architecture that applies anywhere. It depends on how you've allocated or divided powers between the national, or the center and the periphery, however you want to describe it.
Well, you mentioned the Supreme Court several times, and I think it's, obviously this is one of the huge issues of the election, and I think it's worth going a little bit of background and having you sound off on that. For one thing, the federal court system, as I mentioned, could play a pivotal role in this election. And what we saw with the Republican-controlled Senate led by Mitch McConnell at the end of Barack Obama's presidency was that they essentially were blocking as many judicial nominees as they could towards the end, including one Supreme Court seat. And what we have now under the first term of Trump is unbalanced, kind of overrepresentative amount of picks that Trump has been able to have, the most in some 40 years for the federal judiciary. And he's now appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. And the balance of the court is now 6-3 conservative versus liberal justices, with John Roberts now being something of a swing vote, but frankly, and I give him all the credit in the world for that, and I get upset with liberals who just want to portray him as an enemy because they don't agree with him on key issues, but can't say he agreed with us on other issues that were important. But he's less of a swing vote than Kennedy and other swing justices in the past. And so what you had for decades before now was essentially a 5-4 slightly conservative court with a swing vote that really went both ways many of the times, which kind of reflected the country. We're a slightly right of center country, but that, you know, the court essentially balanced the 2 main parties, which were essentially evenly balanced in the country, population-wise. And now we have a 6-3 conservative majority where all the conservative justices are pretty young, with the exception of Thomas. And, you know, it's such an imbalance that the term court packing, meaning specifically the Congress decides to increase the number of justices, generally speaking, at a time where they think it's favorable to their side, and that can backfire. You mentioned the whole thing with FDR where that didn't work out. But the way I look at it, McConnell and the Republicans did their own form of court packing to overrepresent their faction. And so the question is, what do we do? Do Democrats just say, we're going to keep playing by the old rules of the system and basically operate at a disadvantage for, you know, roughly half the country, 40% of the country for the next 30 years? Or do they do something to adjust the balance, which is 6-3 now? Essentially, there's no major ruling where any left of center point of view can have a reasonable expectation of prevailing.
Well, you know, my reaction to this is, you know, in part, yeah, what McConnell did was astonishing, and it proves he's unscrupulous. Unfortunately, he will be reelected. You know, he would have been burnt if Hillary Clinton had simply beaten Donald Trump, too. So when you look back, you know, simply to say, well, now we have to restructure the court, if the Democrats' goal is to demonstrate that they can be as much, you know, scum as McConnell and go and increase the size of the court because they want to add some justices, they too will, you know, demonstrate that they're unscrupulous and, you know, ethically questionable. This is the way the process works. It's unfortunate. 3 justices retired or passed away while Trump was in office. Imagine if Clinton had simply won, she would have replaced these people. So that's the way the system does go.
Probably. I would argue briefly, though, just that they were already talking about impeaching Clinton before she had even possibly been elected. Well, and it's possible that the Republicans might have.
Political BS. And then, you know, frankly, the Dems, instead of refighting, you know, have been refighting the 2016 election, you know, and trying to impeach Trump instead of coming up with more, you know, productive, I think, political programs. I mean, that's not the point I'm trying to get down to. I mean, both sides have gone into a rhetoric of, you know, DEFCON 5 or nuclear options where we're going to impeach you and try to pack the court or expand it, basically because they can't cooperate and govern inside the Congress. The court's fine. The court remains the most highly regarded of the 3 branches of government. If you look at the polls, it will continue to. I think what's unfortunate is that Congress, instead of getting its act together, is going to use the court as, you know, its whipping boy, and that would be horribly unfortunate. And expanding the court for political reasons because they're angry at the way things went, you know, by the Dems will simply, they will be excoriated and they will be guilty of the, you know, sorts of unscrupulousness that McConnell is guilty of. And frankly, if they expand the court, well, if the Republicans take over, they can too. Do we really want to start this kind of nuclear firefight? Or can we become better at governing? And, it seems that unfortunately there was a time when, yeah, we can govern better. It was an option. Right now it's not. But people have decided to write it off. So shame on both sides, hypocrisy on both of their houses. There's nothing wrong with the court. The court's been doing just fine. People complain about particular justices. Scalia in the Second Amendment, he also upheld your right not to be searched despite the legal, despite the implications of using technology for searches, despite the liberals' dissents. Okay, so everybody can find the most hated justices and find the most hated decisions and write people off. But if you go through most of the cases, most of the time, the justices, aren't that far apart on most legal questions, and the ones that they are far apart on are the ones that the media tend to flog the most because they capture the political imagination. At this point, I really do hope that the Dems are not so stupid to fall into this trap, because if they expand the court, or they try to add Puerto Rico or DC as a state now just to gain some more leverage, that can backfire. And so, again, find a way to beat people, run someone stronger against McConnell, pull the party together, get the wings pulled together, maybe quiet down AOC as Pelosi tried to do a little bit, so that you can show a more united front, get back to the way of managing the party that used to be successful. Can they do it? Well, again, if they take over all three houses, both houses, and the White House, I guess that's the third house, they've got the opportunity to govern and govern well. Will they? Again, I guess the Senate's in place, so we'll see. Again, if I would just find it devastating. I actually wrote a piece on this. There's nothing wrong with the court if Congress goes and beats up the court.
And we'll include a link to that in the notes here.
Yeah, that would be devastating. That would mean every single one of them is just as bad as McConnell. McConnell's unscrupulous. He's unprincipled. If the Dems want to prove they can be that way too, then we're stuck, really.
Well, I wouldn't disagree that for me, for example, the way I see it, the Republicans have been so bad at breaking precedents and norms that I feel that the Democrats have been forced to respond to some degree by not forced to go as low as they are, but forced to do some of the same. Just as one example, just watching Barack Obama on the campaign trail right now, there hasn't been any president in recent memory that has been, I think you have to go back to Teddy Roosevelt, really, campaigning after he lost in a third party run against the incumbent he didn't like, for his chosen successor or what have you. But Barack Obama's out there really, really ripping into Trump in a way that he didn't quite do in 2016. And there's something of a norm-breaking precedent where a recent president comes out and campaigns to that degree in that partisan a way. But I would argue, I'm not going to put that on Obama. It's that Trump is such an aberration and so extreme and so outside the norm, so beyond the pale, so awful that it warranted that type of a response. And what I guess I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I guess the main problem I have with the argument is that with the Republicans already having the system so, not by design of the founders, but it is what it is, stacked in their favor, with them having, we can go all the way back to Biden and Robert Bork, where he derailed Robert Bork's nomination. But if you look at Robert Bork, he was a very extreme judge at a time that very much would not have represented the mainstream American thought on the Constitution, on various legal issues. And we jump ahead now to Merrick Garland, who is as center milquetoast as it gets, center left, but really center. And that's the type of person that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans blocked. And to me, there's no equivalence in the sense that, yes, you can point to patterns in different decisions. The Democrats, for example, did change the confirmation rules to make it just 51 for all federal judicial nominees except the Supreme Court, but that was because McConnell was blocking the Democrats in an unprecedented way. And then it was the Republicans who took it to the next level after already doing that and making that a 51 majority instead of 60 needed to confirm a Supreme Court justice. So I do see, yes, that the Democrats definitely are in this dance with the Republicans, and they too are pushing norms and barriers and breaking them. But I would argue, how are they supposed to even win elections if the Republicans have the power at the time in certain ways, and they're taking things to such an extreme degree? Do the Democrats do nothing in terms of changing the rules of the game and keep losing and keep having to play by the old rules? And when do they get to actually, fight some fire with fire, even allowing for the fact that they're still, not going as far in trying to balance the old rules, but also compete with the system that the Republicans are gaming to their advantage?
Well, you can game the system, but if you change the rules, you set precedent. And again, yeah, there was Bork, but Scalia and Ginsburg were appointed unanimously, and so it can be done. But, it's unfortunate, but it's the nature of politics, too. It pox on both houses. The leaders, in my opinion, really aren't doing anything to improve politics. They're simply making it worse. And again, if the leaders don't behave, you can't really expect their followers to see, to find any leadership to help break this. Hey, it's 11 o'clock. We've been at this for an hour and a half now. I do need to bring this to an end.
Sure. Let's can I ask you a final question?
Sure.
On the way out. You obviously know your history well, and you teach at a school in the South, which has a history, obviously, of electoral violence in a way that other parts of the country do not. There's a lot of commentary, a lot of very same people who are not chicken littles running around screaming about the sky falling types, usually even-keeled, calm, who are freaking out about the possibility of violence in the wake of this election in a way that none of us have seen in our lifetimes. And I was wondering what you could offer as far as your thoughts with the possibility of violence and, the larger idea of a stolen election.
Well, I think it's unfortunate. It's really rather remarkable, but you look at the New York, from D.C. and other cities, like people are worried about this. They're spending money boarding up their businesses. But, over the last 6 months, we've seen that there's good reason, regardless of the fact that marches and whatnot and protests might be justified. There are folks who are either infiltrating or, showing up and, propagating violence in and around protests, which is a threat to people's property. And you just see the cities boarding up, right? So what are you going to do? It would be unwise, it would be foolish if people didn't prepare for that. It's unfortunate that this is something we've come to deal with, right, in the last couple of years. But again, this really began 4 years ago. It is unprecedented for folks to march on Washington in the wake of a presidential election to protest it, and yet we had that. Politics sadly is changing. I don't know if that's, if marching on Washington to protest an election result is positive or not. I mean, if folks certainly are free to do it, they're free to protest whatever they want. But unfortunately, there are organizations or groups out there that are able to take advantage of protests and use them for cover to propagate violence. So the question is, how do we manage this? We haven't found a very good way to do it yet, at least based on this summer. But I think we will eventually. But it's unfortunate. I think there could be protests either way. But it's also a demonstration, again, of the state of politics in the country, the abject lack of leadership on both sides. There is no Messiah out there yet. There is no fill in the blank. Roosevelt, if Roosevelt could unite the lunch pail types and the coastal elites, if Obama could, even Nixon did, Reagan did.
Biden might. Biden might, possibly.
Maybe. Well, the question is, will it be sustainable? And maybe Biden will. We'll see. We'll see how the vote splits. But it needs to be sustained. So you sort of had a Kennedy, LBJ. Even though Nixon won, Nixon moved forward on civil rights acts, the housing law, fair housing law, and whatnot as well. So it can be done. But unfortunately, there isn't that spirit right now. Politics is won and lost by, exacerbating polarization exacerbating violence, if not in deed, then in word. And it's the state of our politics. When you look at the broadcast media, you see it. So,
well, I agree completely with.
Get better.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with what you were saying. Other than the fact that I guess I just say that the Republicans have almost forced the Democrats, unfortunately, to respond with some of the regrettable, I'd argue, necessary tactics. But I do agree in general with what you were saying. I really do appreciate your time as well and your insight. It was great, to get into all this with you. And thanks again. And I hope we have a safe, free, fair election. And yeah, really, thanks so much for your time and your thoughts.
Sure thing, man. Take it easy.
You too. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for today's edition of the Real Context News Podcast. I hope you all voted if you're able to. And thanks again for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode. And let's just say, I really hope Joe Biden wins. Because if you read one of my soon-to-be released pieces, nothing less than the fate of American democracy around the world, and the West as an entity lie in the balance. So, thanks again for listening, and let's hope Joe Biden wins.